Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with some of the lawsuits and where they stand. Your office is leading the way on a multi-state lawsuit to challenge President Trump's executive order on tariffs. Why did you take up this issue, and what's the status of the case?
Well, this is a really interesting moment in our country's history where you see the president trying to rework our economy using tariffs, and he's doing it by abusing an emergency power that no other president has ever done. And the thing that folks need to remember about tariffs is that those are things that are paid for by you and I. You think about Goldman Sachs, you think about JP Morgan, they'll show that about 60 to 70% of the tariffs are paid by us. And you're starting to see big companies, Black & Decker, Walmart, others along those lines saying we're now going to start paying the cost. So this was important for us when we think about quality of living, the cost of goods in our communities, that we had to stop, make the president pause, and do tariffs the right way, the way Congress intended, where there's sideboard safeguards for our consumers. So that's the genesis of the case. We just argued the case about a week and a half ago in Washington, D.C. before an appeals court, 11 judges, and we're hopeful to have a ruling here in the next couple of months.
The last time you were on this program, your office had just joined the lawsuit against a presidential executive order to end birthright citizenship. What's happening with that case?
Yeah, and this is the multitude of cases that we've had to file, and I kind of put our cases in three different categories. One is funding, right? We're protecting about $3.3 billion of funding. And there's kind of ones on essential rights that we all kind of take for granted in a democracy, and one of these is this case, this birthright citizenship case, which the idea that if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States, and that's the way presidents in our country have interpreted this law for more than 100 years. We've been, again, successful in this case, just like we were successful in the tariffs case. It's now up on appeal in the appeals court. And again, just like the other cases, will continue to wind its way through the courts. We do anticipate to be successful on this as well. Primarily, if you just look at the history of the United States and Republican and Democratic presidents, how they've interpreted our U.S. Constitution.
Are there any other immigration-related lawsuits right now Oregon's taking part in?
Yeah, there's a handful of things that are going on with respect to immigration or funding that is tied to immigration. So think about the way that our Department of Transportation interacts with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Sometimes they're putting terms and conditions on that, trying to compel the state to comply with certain federal laws that are in conflict with state laws. And so we have a lawsuit to try and figure that out, which is the proper way. Now, we have prior case law history that shows that our Oregon laws actually supersede these types of terms and conditions that are trying to bring on us. We also have cases in healthcare, right, where they are trying to have our Medicaid centers share data with the federal government in a way that is impacting how people access healthcare. And we're saying, no, you got to do it the right way. You got to do it how it's been done for decades upon decades. And so there's a lawsuit that we have really trying to keep us in the same vein of access to healthcare, which is a big value I know that all Oregonians share.
It's Monday, August 11th. The most recent lawsuit the state has joined involves Planned Parenthood. Tell us about that case and where does it stand right now?
So this is the beginning of the Trump administration really attacking our healthcare, and we've talked a little bit about that. What is going on right now is the Trump administration has attacked the Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood. Now, you got to remember, Planned Parenthood funds cancer screenings, they fund contraception. In fact, they rely on a ton of Medicaid funding for the services they provide to Oregonians across this state. The federal government is specifically attacking the Planned Parenthood for their advocacy, and they're targeting them. And it's impacting practically only Planned Parenthood across this nation. And it's one of the most un-American ways to target a single organization based upon their advocacy and their speech. Incredibly un-American, and that's what the lawsuit is about their attacking Planned Parenthood based upon their advocacy. And so we have two cases going. We're involved in one specifically as the state, and then there is a case back east that has already gotten a positive ruling. And so these cases will continue to make their way through the court system. Again, it is incredibly important that we're protecting this value.
The president signed an executive order to block access to gender-affirming care for people under 19. It seeks to cut off federal funding for some of that medical care. Why did the state join a lawsuit looking to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, this is very early on. And for those, again, in Oregon, healthcare and access to healthcare is incredibly important to all of us. And what we absolutely do not want is we do not want politicians getting into our examination room and trying to impact the decisions that we're making. That's effectively what the federal government is doing right now. We trust as Oregonians, doctors, we trust patients in consultation with their doctors to make the right decisions for themselves and their families. And what they're trying to do is manipulate administrative terms to get into that examination room without having to go through the normal process that a lot of medical procedures and how procedures get approved normally happen.
On the flip side, there are 3 girls suing the state and OSAA to stop transgender girls from playing in girls' sports. How will your office respond to that suit and defend the state?
Yeah, and so one of the responsibilities that we have as the Oregon Department of Justice is when lawsuits are filed against the state of Oregon or parties such as the governor, who is one of the parties in this case, we act as the attorneys for those entities and defend them in court. When we do so, we make sure that we're following the laws of the state, and we make sure that we're moving forward in a way that has transparency. So same thing in this situation, we'll be defending the state in that lawsuit.
Oregon is part of a multi-state lawsuit challenging the Trump administration over threats to cut federal funding for public schools that practice DEI initiatives. Where does that case stand?
Yeah, so there's been a host of interesting executive decisions. That's one thing that people sure to remember, right? When you're making really significant decisions that are impacting communities, normally you do that in Congress. Normally you do that with public input. The problem that we're seeing right now is that these decisions are being made in the dark by one human being in the Oval Office, and it's attacking things that we all hold near and dear. And you mentioned it, education. This is a really big thing going on right now. They tried to basically fire a ton of people at the Department of Education, which effectively would have made its mission non-existent. And so that is one of our lawsuits. They tried to cut funding. It was roughly about $6.9 billion to all the states. We fought that in court. The federal government backtracked because they had a losing case. And then you have them nitpicking and trying to selectively target different types of funding streams that Congress allocated. Now remember, when Congress allocates something, you got to follow the law. That is a law that is passed. The president doesn't just get to come in and say, no, I know Congress, you passed the law, but I just don't want to follow it anymore. That wouldn't work for us, and it certainly doesn't work for him, and so far the courts have been agreeing with us. So that's kind of the spirit of how right now the Trump administration is attacking education.
We've just run through a litany of lawsuits here. President Trump won the 2024 election, won the popular vote and the Electoral College. His supporters say he should have the right to shape the country the way he chooses. How do you respond to that argument?
You know, I absolutely agree. When you win an election, you are granted an immense amount of power. But here is where I disagree. What I disagree is I don't care whether it's you, me, my wife, my son, the president, anyone sitting in Congress, you got to follow the laws. You have to follow our Constitution. That is the baseline. And right now you have a president that is willfully neglecting his oath, his responsibility to follow the Constitution. That's why we're winning so successfully in all of the court decisions. You're having judges appointed by Republicans. You're having judges appointed by Democrats, consistently ruling that the Trump administration is violating his oath to follow the Constitution. Think about the tariff case. Those were 2 judges, one appointed by Trump himself, one appointed by Reagan, and one appointed by Clinton, that unanimously agreed that he had abused an emergency power. That's what's going on right now. I do agree, though, when you have a democracy and you have elections, there is a transfer of power, and that should be honored, but you gotta stay in your lanes. And right now we have a president that wants to expand his executive power, and that's not the way our country was built. We didn't want that. Our country was founded on moving away from kings, having so much centralized powers. That's the big disagreement we're having in our country right now.
We see you and many other Democratic attorneys general in the national news suing the administration over these executive orders. Explain, how do you view that part of the job, being a bit of the representation of the opposition to the Trump administration?
You know, first off, I would love to talk about all the amazing people that work at the Department of Justice now. They serve Oregon, all the amazing things that we do, from protecting consumers, keeping communities safe. But you point out what is going on right now that gets all the media, which is when you have a president that is overstepping his bounds. That's the one thing that catches people's eyes. And what I can tell folks, and I don't care whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or a libertarian, the way we decide to move forward as a Department of Justice is we look, are Oregonians being impacted by what the president is doing? And if the answer is yes, we then move to the next question, which is the cause of that impact because the president has violated the Constitution or whether he's violated a law? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, and we have standing to file a lawsuit, we absolutely will, because that is our responsibility to do so as the Oregon Department of Justice. But what I can tell you is when we walk into that courtroom, it's incredibly important to me that we have integrity and that we're bringing solid cases.
On that note, a lot of people may just see your name in the headline, Attorney General Dan Rayfield suing the Trump administration, and they don't actually know what else your office does. Could you just briefly explain what else the AG does?
Yeah, absolutely. These are things we get excited about when working on them. Right now, we're expanding our work to keep communities safe. And really what we're trying to do is partner with a couple of local counties to tackle organized crime. And you think about organized crime in your community, you think about illicit massage parlors, drug trafficking, retail theft. In Southern Oregon, it's labor trafficking with illegal marijuana grows. This is an area where the Oregon Department of Justice can have an increased impact to keep communities safe. So we're starting to work on that and partnering with Washington County and Multnomah County as we're moving forward in that space. The other thing we're doing is how do we expand our work to protect consumers, seniors, working families? You need an Oregon Department of Justice that looks out for everyone. So we just came out of the legislative session and we're doubling the amount of attorneys here at the Oregon Department of Justice and the resources to be able to tackle these big issues. So I don't care whether it's big things like your big opioid lawsuits or whether it's fly-by-night, scams that come in and out of our communities. I want an Oregon Department of Justice that serves Oregonians better for decades to come. And so these are the things, so many things that we do at the Oregon Department of Justice that we're excited about.
On Monday, President Trump announced he's placing Washington, D.C. police under direct federal control, deploying the National Guard to the nation's capital. He outlined that move at the White House Monday morning. I'm curious how you view that move from the White House.
Well, the first thing for folks is they're trying to digest that. You want to distinguish it from what happened in Southern California in most recent couple of weeks, and noting that Washington, D.C. is not a state, and so know that there's a little bit of differences. But what I would really focus, and this is something that we were paying attention to prior to Trump even taking office, is that could happen here in Oregon, and we were preparing with our governor in his space to be ready in the event that would occur. The first place it did occur was in California, and California filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration to stop their use of National Guard under those circumstances. We filed an amicus brief as Oregon supporting California in their lawsuit, and we were successful in that space. And so should these things trickle their way into Oregon, I expect the same result. I expect the same level of scrutiny under any action when you have a federal government that's mobilizing federal forces to use them in a police-type scenario, which is unheard of in our democracy.
Back to the D.C. issue, though, you outlined the distinctions there, D.C. not being a state. Do you look at what's happening there and say, oh, this could happen in Oregon, or are you looking at that as a totally separate issue?
It's tough to know. It's very early on to see how that is going to manifest itself. These things could happen in Oregon. They have already happened in California. I think what is important for us as a state, we have a governor that is focused, working with our Oregon Department of Justice to be ready in the event that should occur. And we're doing everything in our power to make sure that it doesn't happen in the first place. And so I think for us, we feel very prepared, for all the eventualities, whether it's this or something else.
What's that preparation look like here in Oregon?
So for us, again, this goes back to prior to Trump taking office. This is not a new thing. The president had been talking about, stepping into this lane and mobilizing the National Guard. And so these were things that we had been looking at. We have partnerships with attorneys general across this country doing research, so that way, should something happen, we're prepared to file and protect the rights of Oregonians in court. And to give you an idea, is when you're not prepared and you're not seeing these things coming, you are not as prepared, you haven't done the homework, and you're not ready to file the very next day. A perfect example of that is all the things that the president was talking about is that birthright citizenship case we talked about at the very beginning. We had that case filed in less than 24 hours after that executive order had been filed because we knew he was going to do that. And we also knew through a lot of due diligence and frankly just common sense that what he was doing was unconstitutional.
The U.S. Supreme Court is being asked to take up a case this fall to overturn marriage rights to same-sex couples nationwide. If the Supreme Court decides to hear that case, how could it affect Oregonians?
Well, I stand in the camp right now in a place of optimism where I am hopeful that they will not take that case up. Obviously, if they do, that will be an incredible legal battle. Here in Oregon, marriage equality is something we've valued for a very long time, and we will make sure and do everything in our power at all levels of government to make sure that that is a reality here in the state of Oregon, no matter what happens at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Do you see any other legal fights looming with the federal government?
Each day brings, with it a new set of challenges. Right now, one of the things here at the Oregon Department of Justice is we're seeing terms and conditions put on Victims of Crime Act dollars. That potentially is going to result in a 75% decrease in funding here in Oregon for victims of crime. That is unconscionable. I expect we'll fight that. The other thing, keep in the back of your head, we have 35 lawsuits right now. Incredibly high standards when we file, incredibly high success rate, but we're protecting about $3.3 billion worth of funding that otherwise would have come into the state. So there's a lot at stake right here as we're navigating these things. And most certainly, if they continue down this path and continue to do unconstitutional things, continue to violate the law, we'll continue to hold them accountable in court.
I do have one process question. You bring the lawsuit, the loser, so to speak, could then appeal it to the next level of courts. Is the ultimate end result for these lawsuits that they end up before the United States Supreme Court, or could they end another way?
It can absolutely end in a multitude of ways. And the first thing to keep in mind is we've gotten a lot of preliminary injunctions, which is the first step. And that means the judge has ruled that we're likely to prevail on the merits and that there's going to be irreparable harm. Incredibly high standard to get there. Sometimes when you get that, the federal government will just back off. So one of our education funding cases, the government just started to allow the money to flow back into our states. There's other situations where they're putting their foot down and they want to continue to appeal this up to the next level. Now, that doesn't mean that each appeals court is going to take the case when it gets to the Supreme Court. So you might see some cases where we prevail at the appellate court level, but the Supreme Court decides not to take it. And then invariably, I think that some of these cases might wind up in the Supreme Court as we wind our way through the litigation process. So they could end in a multitude of ways.
Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield, we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.